start by saving our AC4 stabilization composition now that the stage has completed processing. We will now need to take some time to review the stabilized track. There are many ways to review your data, but we'll do the same way we reviewed the test intervals earlier in this tutorial. We'll play through the whole track a few times, looking out for obvious issues on any frames. We can see approaching the end of the clip, there are some issues with the narrow barrel of the prop gun she draws. That is an error that we can best address using the template match stage, manually setting keyframes and segment length to help preserve the shape of the prop. During the texture transfer stage, we'll need to set a radius large enough to capture the surface variations between our original capture and the cleaned result, but too high of a capture radius will result in incorrectly transferring adjacent surfaces on the capture, such as inside of the sleeves, or the side of the body, or the hair to the shoulder. Because of this, the maximum amount of error we can tolerate depends on the complexity imposed of the surface of each frame. Overall, the clip looks pretty good. On many clips, this may be the final step in stabilization. However, this clip is a very difficult subject, so we suspect there will be more issues revealed in the heat map. If we discover issues, we will be considering 3 different approaches for improving our final results. For areas where the error are likely caused by the keyframe chosen by stabilization, like the twisting gun, we can use template match to give us fine control for the adjustments we are looking to make. We expect to have some areas that the best solution will be making manual adjustments to the settings in our texture transfer stage to make sure we are catching only the details we want to transfer. Finally, we will also create one final stabilization stage. Again, it will have an even tighter segment max error where it's necessary to ensure that the greatest precision possible between our original capture and final product. Let's go ahead and create that final stabilization stage. As we review, we'll be creating new intervals in this stage as needed. We will set most of the parameters similarly to what we ran previously with a few adjustments. They should be the alpha point at 0.1. We'll keep the alpha rigid at 125 with carry frame enabled, alpha smooth at 200. We'll set the match distance limit to 0.05 and lower the segment max error to 0.03. We're going to run the sample radius factor at 14. This should help with some of the mesh wells and noise that's causing surface error. In the interval containing frames 0 to 55, we can still see a small degree of error in between the actor's arms in the first 7 frames. Because of the constraints of this capture, that might be a little too much error for a successful texture transfer. Let's add an interval to our new stage for frames 0 to 14. Getting back into the heat map review, we can see that the hair between frames 24 and 31 is still a bit of a hot spot. The error is actually quite low, but because of the location, we want to make sure that this is as accurate as possible. There are still a few flickers on the back of the skirt, as well as the left interior side of the actor's sleeves around frame 45 and 46, as well as some deeper wells on the interior of the actor's left arm from frames 35 to 48. We can create another interval on our new stabilization stage under the affected segment, frames 35 to 48, to limit the possible error. While there are also some issues on frames in the next segment, frames 49 to 55, because the errors are under the sleeve, any artifact should be hard to see. We'll check after running texture transfer to see if we need to adjust any of the settings for this stage to achieve perfect results. Moving on to the next interval, we can see that there are very minor discrepancies again. The first frame, 56, has some high error under the folds of the sleeve and on the skirt. If we adjust the heat map settings a bit, we can see that the error is within 0.035. For most clips, a value this low would be acceptable, but because of the proximity of our hair to the left shoulder, we will want to make sure that any error is removed from this section. Frames 56 to 62 have a bit of an issue on the back of the skirt, so let's make an interval on our stabilization stage from 56 to 62. From frames 63 to 66, we can also see a few problems. A small well in the front of the skirt on frame 63 is likely to cause us a problem because of the proximity of the sleeve hanging over the front of the dress, as well as the deep well inside of the left outer sleeve. We'll make another interval for frames 63 to 66. For the segment containing frames 71 to 78, we may have some issues with the right sleeve. The actual error isn't very high, but because of the close proximity of the sleeve to the actor's body, a small discrepancy could be impossible to capture during texture transfer, without also incorrectly projecting the body onto the sleeve. We'll make an interval on our new stabilization stage from frames 71 to 78. The wells in the skirt are quite severe and are showing an error distance of higher than it should be with our current settings. For this interval, we will set the segment max error lower than the other intervals. We'll adjust to this interval's segment max error to 0.02. On frames 80 and 81, there's a pretty obvious spot on the back of the skirt that will cause us some issues as well as some problems under the left sleeve throughout the segment. We'll recreate this segment in the new stabilization stage to give it another pass. Finally, on frame 91, the inside of the arms are a bit of an issue, and the back of the skirt is close enough that it may not capture correctly in texture transfer without a low cage radius. We will make a small interval for frames 91 and 92. Looking at the interval containing frames 95 to 107, we're really starting to see smaller segment sizes as a result of the lowered segment max error. Frame 98 is the only frame in this interval that has any red in the heat map, and it's both in a hard to notice place and likely not to cause problems during texture transfer, so we can leave this segment as it is. With frames 108 to 135, we're looking at a lot of small segments again in this interval, but we have a few spots of red to check out. There are some scattered issues on frame 111 and frame 115. There's a serious issue on the left side of the skirt. On frame 121 and 122, there are issues with the sleeves and some deep pockets in the underside of the skirt in the back. These frames are borderline, where they might cause an issue at a later point. We'll take a closer look at these frames when we get to the texture transfer stage and try a few techniques to see if we can fix these problems then. Frame 127 and 128 also have a fair bit of red in them. We'll make an interval for this segment and rerun it in the next round of stabilization. Looking through this interval containing frames 136 to 159, there aren't any serious issues. Frame 142 has a bit more red than desirable, but if it does cause some minor texture issues, they shouldn't be noticeable in playback. We'll leave this interval as it is for now. Also, on frames 149 and 150, there's a hole that's created from the source mesh on frame 149. And since that's the keyframe for this small segment, the hole gets picked up in the next frame as well. We will fix this in template match by keeping the two frames in the segment together but changing the keyframe. With frames 160 and 180, the majority of this interval is quite good, except for frames 163, 169, 175, 172 under the left sleeve, and 179. On frame 163, if we set the heat map's error max to 0.04, we can see that the area under the arm has a very high error. We don't want this to be an issue for texture transfer, so we'll make intervals for frame 160 to 163 as well as frames 169 to 170. For frames 172, 175, and 179, we'll try addressing these during texture transfer by using specific stage settings to address the issues. On frame 181 to 201, from frame 189 to 199, the chin is very close to the shoulder throughout these segments, so any small discrepancies will cause an issue in the texture transfer stage. We can see errors large enough to be addressed between frames 184 and 189, as well as between frames 192 and 198 and 199. We'll create new intervals in the second stabilization stage for these frames as well. And because of the proximity of the chin for the last interval, we'll decrease the error max even further to 0.02. For the interval with 202 and 217, the whole interval looks good. There are slight issues that might require special attention during the texture transfer stage on frames 205 and 206, where the left sleeve connects with the body of the actor, and on the back of the skirt during frames 213 and 218. On frames 218 to 251, we're getting to the intervals where we saw we had some issues with the consistency of the prop gun that's drawn from the actor's belt. We'll start by reviewing those problems. We can use the side-by-side view to make note of the frames that did not stabilize well and work using template match to fix the mesh for those frames. The gun is twisted and unstable on frames 229 to 230, 232 to 233, 235 to 236, and frame 239. Going back to heat mode, we can see that frame 218 and 219 are likely to cause some small issues, enough that we'll add those two frames to an interval in our second stabilization stage. Other than that, all of the other issues overlap with frames that are going to be fixed up in template match. For the final interval, 252 to 271, using the side-by-side again, we can see that this interval also has some issues with the shape of the prop that will need to be corrected during template match. The gun starts to be a problem on frame 254 and continues to 257, as well on frames 269 and 270. Back in heat map mode, we can see that from frames 259 to 262, there are some minor issues under the sleeve, and the skirt has deep wells in frame 265 to 268. We'll create intervals for these segments, and for the final interval, we're adding to our new stabilization stage. Again, we'll adjust the segment max error to 0.02 to make sure that that spot is corrected before moving on to texture transfer. We'll save this as AC 4.2 Stabilization Review, select the intervals we prepared, and execute them. Now that we've reviewed the few remaining problems after processing stabilization, we'll take a look at the main mesh problems with template match before moving on to texture transfer.